Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 seems like it's not going to land anywhere near as well as... I feel like this is like a weird... If you go dig and you scratch away at the surface, you realize that there's a considerable problem with THPS 4.
A huge problem, Scott. I have gone from being so excited for this double whammy of remasters to feeling like they are completely missing the point of doing 3 and 4. And that's because it's been confirmed by their official website that they are changing the structure of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, which got away from the original trilogy's just plain old focus on those 2-minute game modes, I suppose, where you get 2 minutes within a level and you have to collect all of the skate letters, or you have to do a combo, you have to do whatever, and then you get kicked out and you have to go back in, right? Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 was the first game that introduced what was known then as a career mode and would later just be known as, I think it was just the regular mode in Tony Hawk's Underground and Tony Hawk's Underground 2, where you didn't have that time limit. That time limit was gone. You still had the same activities. You were still doing what you were doing in the previous games, but you weren't kind of punished for experimenting. You weren't punished for messing around, and you would have to go up to NPCs and characters within those levels, talk to them, get a mission from them, and then do it. But it was so much more relaxed than any of the other games. And I just think, like, if you're going to bring these titles back, if you're going to do the complete Pro Skater set, why sacrifice the core mode that made many fans, myself included, think that was the best Pro Skater? That's my favorite Pro Skater, because it got away from that established formula. And I was reading a really interesting article over on The Gamer where they were talking about how the purpose of remastering these two games if you don't have that core element, because they point out that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, that's already incorporated mechanics that were introduced in the later games anyway.
Totally.
So essentially without that, it kind of feels like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 is a glorified map pack.
Like a level pack.
A level pack. You get new skaters, you get new music, you get new levels, but at the cost of what many people would buy this remaster for, I would argue anyway.
There's a whole thing with this, which I feel like no one's really talking about, where a lot of people reported a few years ago that Tony Hawk's 3 and 4 remasters were cancelled. Like, obviously 1 and 2 remakes, I would say, went down incredibly well. I know that internally, I don't think they sold enough that it wowed Activision overall. But it seemed like back then the general idea was to can further remakes, and so that was the conversation for the last sort of 2-3 years, was like, oh, more's not happening. And then all of a sudden Tony Hawk said like, oh no, something is happening with this. Then he got on Colbert and announced. I know it leaked in previous weeks, and now we have the announcement trailer. But it feels like, because it's Iron Galaxy putting this together on the development side, which have a bit of a spotty reputation. They're a bit of an outsourced studio for a lot of things, and it feels like, it's almost like this is the bare minimum that we could do with the resources allocated, kind of thing. We're not doing it properly, quote unquote. We're not going to invest as much in it as we did in the first two. And I also wonder how much money has been allocated to the soundtracks, because there was a whole thing for Tony Hawk's 1 and 2 to try and get all the rights back for that original soundtrack, and they managed to, but they patched like 2 songs back in, or they announced 2 songs right before launch because it took right up until the wire to do it. I wonder if you're big Jimmy Corpo, like, barely parting with you, and like, oh, fine, we'll do it. We'll give you just this amount. We're going to hire a outsourced studio. You can do the level packs. You can't do the career mode because we're not going to do more voice acting or whatever it is. We're not going to remaster it. And do we just do the most sort of bare bones version of this? Because that's some money, and we can put microtransactions in it, and we can do that stuff, and we can further monetize it that way, and that's how they've justified it internally.
That's the real worry. Ever since this game was announced, like you said, I wanted to believe the X-Files. I wanted to believe.
Parappa.
But the fact that it's not Vicarious Visions who developed the original game, that company doesn't even exist anymore. It was sent over to Blizzard and became an entirely different studio. The fact that it isn't them on the development duties, the fact that it doesn't have this mode, the fact that it feels like it's happened very, very quickly. I'm sure it'll be all right, but the first bundled remaster release from Vicarious Visions, that was such a labor of love. That just was such a high quality product. It was pretty much everything you would have wanted if you wanted those games to come back, if you were a diehard Tony Hawk's Pro Skater fan. And to me, I loved those games, but as we've said many, many times on this podcast, I was always a Tony Hawk's realistically, a Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 guy, a Tony Hawk's Underground guy, and a Tony Hawk's Underground 2 guy. Those were the golden years for me personally. So it was always kind of a promise of maybe we'll get to those games at some point. And now they're finally getting to those games, but they're not quite the versions of them that I wanted. It makes me worry, like, do we stop here? Does this completely rule out the idea of a Tony Hawk's Underground remaster? Because that thing is all story. That thing is all the career mode here, fully fleshed out, and cars with voice acting, with cutscenes. You know, it goes all in on that stuff. And if you're not going to do it here, are you going to bother doing that work or relicensing that work for another one, or will this be the end of the remaster project, as it were?
That's what I was going to ask, is like a lot of people taking this is like, well, this proves they won't do Thug because there's going to be a lot more, like you said, effort put into to make those games work. The thing that's interesting is like, it's almost like, it's not as simple as this, obviously, but as a visualization, like a sliding scale of like, you know, straight up remaster, which is just like frame rates improved, and then graphical overhaul, remake it, Capcom style, like with the Resident Evil remakes at the other end. And this thing, not like, to me, when I saw the reveal trailer, is closer to the other end, like the high end, than I was expecting. I thought they would just take the originals, up the frame rate, and that would be all you'd get. It'd be more like Crystal Dynamics stuff, like what they've done with Tomb Raider and things like that, and Soul Reaver. So the fact that they did, or they are, overhauling the graphics and everything was promising. So, but then it's interesting because they did sort of gut the campaign to do this, and it is ostensibly just overhauled biomes, which is maybe a little bit easier to do. But to that end, if you apply even that graphical polish to, you know, Thug or whatever, you've got really outdated vehicle mechanics in a lot of those things. And that's part of the charm, like, you know, and you can get off the board and climb stuff and whatever. I think internally they'll have that conversation on what are people expecting, you know, and it'll be coming after GTA 6 or something. So it's like, is it worth doing if you're not going to do it enough? And then, you know, people don't want full realistic car physics in a skateboarding game. Maybe that would take them, but it's not what you'd be expecting necessarily. So I wonder if you imagine that scale, I wonder what that's like to try and pin that down.
I know. I mean, for one, those car mechanics, they were ass back then, you know what I mean? So I don't think, you're not expecting Gran Turismo level handling if you do go down the remake route for Thug. But I was also thinking about what you said there about this looking like a proper premium upgrade, like a proper premium remake. And I don't know, I wonder how much of the visual presentation here, and look, let me do a disclaimer. It's not easy to make any game, but the fact that you have the foundation of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, you've got the models, you've got the systems, the underlying systems of how skating feels. At a certain point, you've got the textures, you've got the animations. It must be easier to translate all of that stuff and add to it to make a few extra levels, some more skaters, than it was to build that game from scratch, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's why they're kind of in that situation. Again, this is all hypothetical that you said of maybe they had a certain amount of time, a certain amount of money to do it, and said, well, it's going to be way easier if we take those textures, take those animations, take those skaters, put them essentially within a new level set, add some new music on, and kind of call it a day, rather than give it that proper ground-up remake approach that the first two had.
Well, the whole thing makes me think, like, why now? Like, I was just Googling to make sure, like, the 25th anniversary was last year, the sort of end of last year. I mean, the Pro Skater 1 and 2 came out in September in 2021. So it's like, it is like a weird overall thing of why now? Unless it just ties into the general idea of like, well, we're revisiting the 90s everywhere and the early 2000s everywhere. So there's a bit of money to be made. And then Activision's SEO team looks at all the different search terms and realizes people are talking about skating again. Yeah. Actually, to be honest, it's maybe more personal theory that EA is pushing Skate again, like because they're out there offering access to the closed beta for Skate 4. There's a whole leak thing going on about the microtransactions in Skate, according to Insider Gaming. So there's that whole conversation on if the skating genre explodes again, we should have something in there, and trying to posit it that way.
And you know what? I've been very negative on the approach to this project, but I am just pleased that it's happening at all. I'm happy that we're just getting a version of it, because
I should say I'm psyched for it. I haven't played 4, so I don't have the frame of reference. So I'm just psyched to play more Tony Hawk's, but I get they've taken a lot out of it.
Exactly, and I mean, it's still going to be a good game. Like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, this doesn't affect at all, really. I'm sure that's still going to be pristine. So if that's your favorite, hey, don't let me convince you to not pre-order it and not buy it. I'm sure that'll be everything you want and more. It's just, I'm just happy that it's managed to find a way out somehow, because even a few years ago, it felt like stuff like this was impossible under Activision. And it makes me wonder if they have pivoted since the Microsoft acquisition to have more games and to treat their back catalog and library a little bit better, because until very recently it was super hyper focused on their biggest franchises and nothing else got a look in. Like, I'm pretty sure we know that they were making a new Crash Bandicoot game to follow up Crash Bandicoot 4.
Yes.
That never ended up happening. There were so many rumors about a new Spyro, which never ended up happening. All of the development teams that were working on games like that, Vicarious Visions, Toys for Bob, Beanox, whoever it was, they're now part of the multi-company big franchise treadmill, essentially. They're all working on Call of Duty. They're all working on the Blizzard games. So if we get to a situation where we can peel that back a little bit and have some of those developers, or even outsource it to other developers to work on those back catalog games, those it's weird calling Tony Hawk's a niche game, but I suppose it is in comparison to Call of Duty.
And compared to where the skating scene was at in the early 2000s, like there was that huge boom where it was everywhere, whether it was on MTV or the games themselves, or Tony Hawk was everywhere or whatever. Something on their side says it's worth doing, and then they've sort of hedged their bets, and they haven't gone all the way out in terms of how much they could do. Worth keeping in mind if you were looking forward to that specific mode on 4. Unless they do, maybe they'll do paid DLC for it. But it doesn't seem like that's going to be a thing. We'll see what the response to it is.